You're watching act.tv, and now the country's five largest clusters of coronavirus infections are all inside prisons. ICE detention centers are also major hotbeds of the virus, and yet minimal relief has been provided, and very few inmates or detainees have been released. Sasha Abramsky is with us today to talk about the danger of keeping so many people locked up in close quarters and the solutions we can champion that reimagine what health and safety actually look like in the US. Sasha is a regular guest here on our program. He is also a professor of journalism at UC Davis, and he's the one who writes the Signal Noise column in The Nation magazine. Sasha, thanks for joining us.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me on again.
Well, first, let's talk about the conditions in these detention centers and the prisons that make them such hotbeds for coronavirus outside of what one would just expect.
Well, I've been writing on prisons for 25 years. And back in the 1990s, when we were beginning this experiment with mass incarceration and when we were putting more and more people in prison for longer and longer sentences for smaller and smaller crimes, people who were studying it, journalists, a few academics, some activists, began to realize that we were stacking up this vast number of problems at the back end of the experiment. That, it was all marketed as being about tough on crime. It was marketed about regaining out of control communities and so on and so forth. But in actual fact, what it was doing is it was stacking up this host of social and public health and environmental and all kinds of problems. So you had the building of a prison infrastructure which came to contain 2 to 2.5 million people in prisons, in jails. Now we're seeing it with these vastly expanded immigration detention centers. And the thing is, you can't put that many people into confined spaces and guard them in the way that they're guarded in prisons without compromising their safety. Because what you're doing is you're stacking up large numbers of human beings in areas where it's impossible to socially space. So in California's prisons, for example, as they got more and more overcrowded, you ended up seeing men basically stacked in bunk beds in what used to be public spaces like gymnasiums and speaker halls and so on, and cafeterias. So you'd have 50, 100, 200 people in this tiny space. Now, if you do all of that and you make it hard to access soap, you make it hard to access hand sanitizer and all the things that are in short supply behind bars, if and when you have the spread of a respiratory disease like coronavirus, you've got a recipe for disaster. And so we're seeing that. You said the top 5 clusters are in prisons. We're seeing it in large prisons pretty much all over the country. We're seeing it in jails like Cook County in New York, in Chicago, Rikers Island in New York, LA County Jail. And then you're seeing it in these immigration facilities like Adelanto in California, and these facilities where people are being detained not because they're criminals, they're being detained because they're immigrants. And, this is quite stunning to me that in the middle of a pandemic that's, killed 125,000 Americans and is accelerating rather than slowing down, the administration is doing everything it can to not release immigrant detainees, even when courts tell them they have to.
Yeah, the recent court case that we discussed on the show yesterday, in terms that is saying, that they're going to free the children, or that they need to free the children, but that actually separates the children from their families. Another horror.
Well, it does. And also, that's a very important case because it does sort of set a bar and say, look, you can't keep kids in these facilities and put them at medical risk. But it's also a small number of people. The vast majority of detainees in immigrant detention centers are not children, they're adults. They're asylum seekers, they're undocumented who've lived in this country for years and then been arrested and are facing deportation. And that ruling says nothing about them. Now, there have been other rulings where courts have sort of strongly suggested that medically vulnerable immigration detainees be released, but they aren't being released. We've had some movement in some states to start releasing prisoners. So California's released a few thousand medically vulnerable prisoners, but it's got a prison population of over 100,000. New York's released some medically vulnerable prisoners. So there has been this sort of half-hearted move to scale back prisons. Jails are admitting fewer new inmates at the moment. That is one area where there seems to be a sort of consensus that it's, a good idea to limit the number of new inmates going in. But overall, in the same way as, when the virus got out of control in America, it turns out it's remarkably hard to bring that virus back under control. Same thing with mass incarceration. if you set in place a series of policies that by default put hundreds of thousands and ultimately millions of people behind bars, turns out it's a juggernaut, and it's really, really, really hard to reverse that process at speed in the face of a public health pandemic. And I think, this was obviously
rights groups are
unpredictable, but the basic contours of a disaster accompanying mass incarceration, that was the writing was on the wall on that a generation ago. We just didn't pay attention.
Sasha, rights groups are calling for the release of the ICE detainees and the mass release of prisoners. I'm not suggesting that is a bad idea, but it's to many Americans that seems extreme and brings up fear, and Fox News stokes the fears, et cetera, et cetera. Are there measures that can be done in those facilities that would help mitigate against the problem? I think, wasn't it Cuomo that gave everybody a ton of hand sanitizer? He made prison labor make the hand sanitizer. And then, is there anything else that can be done that would be?
The answer is yes,
helpful?
up to a point. Up to a point, you can do things like make soap and sanitizer more widely available. You can make masks either mandatory or at least available. There are certain basic things that can be done and should be done. But at the end of the day, there's just a problem with the basic model. Because the model of incarceration is you put a ton of people into a confined space and you lock them in that space. You may let them out for exercise a few hours a day, but the basic model is you have lots and lots of people living behind bars in a controlled, armed, guarded environment. And so within that, especially when you have overcrowded facilities, which, most systems are overcrowded because didn't matter how many prisons were built in the 1990s and early 2000s, we were putting more people in prison than those new prisons could safely accommodate. So there's just a basic flaw in the model. If our default is for low-end crimes, we're going to put you behind bars in a way that, almost no other country on earth does. In the same way as we have 4 or 5% of the world's population and we have 25% of confirmed coronavirus cases, almost identical with prisoners. We have 5% of the world's population and about 1/4 of the world's prisoners. It's completely disproportionate. Not because we have vastly higher crime than most of the rest of the world. We have more people in prison because we made a series of policy choices. And it wasn't just Republican, Democrat. If you go back to the 1990s, Bill Clinton was president, but Bill Clinton presided over one of the most extraordinary expansions of prisons at a state level and a federal level in American history. And that was a very opportunistic policy choice. That was a policy choice designed to neutralize Republicans being able to come at him from the right and say Democrats are soft on crime. And now the Democrats have moved away from that. To be fair, there are very few Democrats, if any, at this point saying we want more people in prison. They realize it's a failed experiment.
That's not a winning strategy at this point.
No, exactly. The public has moved on. The public oftentimes takes a while to, understand the importance of a public policy issue. But when it does, it really does. And at the moment, the public has caught up to the fact that putting a lot of people in prison for a long time for not very serious offenses is both extraordinarily expensive public policy. It costs about $50,000 a year in many states to incarcerate someone. And it's also dumb public policy. It doesn't make us safer. It doesn't deal with the fundamental social problems of poverty, inequality, mental health, homelessness, drug addiction, all the things that we know feed into the prison system. Just locking people up, it doesn't solve those things. It may sort of sweep them under the rug for a little bit, but it doesn't fundamentally solve these complicated problems. And the public's aware of that at this point. Now the politicians are playing catch up.
Here in New York, Bill de Blasio has just put forward part of his policy to partially defund, or at least divert some of the money that goes toward from policing programs to a few other programs. One of them includes, I believe it's money for kids who can go to CUNY and get a college education. Your thoughts about a defunding movement for, incarceration? There's companies who are making money off of these people, off of the incarceration state. How can we deal with the financial part?
There are debates in policy circles, there are debates in activist circles. How do you phrase this moment? And some people have said, well, we need to use the language of defunding, whether it's defunding the police or defunding the incarceration infrastructure. And, there's a really important reason for that. And the reason for that is that we've overfunded these institutions for decades, maybe generations. But there's also a danger in the language. And the danger is that when you hear the word defund,
Thank
a lot of
you.
people are going to think, what that means is no funding.
Police. Exactly. That's what I've thought. I thought divert would be a better word.
Yeah, and I'm not an activist on the front lines here, so in a way, it's not for me to say what the language should be. But I do think that,
well, you could make a suggestion.
well, as a writer, it worries me because it seems to me the language is imprecise. Because there are some people who are saying take away all money for police and take away all money for prisons, and that really is defunding. But actually, what a lot of people are saying is we have got a bloated police system and we've got a bloated incarceration system. Yes, we still need a criminal justice infrastructure. I don't think there's anybody out there who says, bless you.
Thank you.
I don't think there's anybody out there who says, we don't want any law enforcement in response to violent crime or, in response to kidnapping or whatever it might be. Most people are going to say, of course, we want law enforcement and we want a judicial system that's capable of intervening in those cases. But, there's a but, do we necessarily want the police as the first responders if there's a mentally ill person going into mental health crisis? Or do we necessarily want the police as the first responders to deal with homelessness? Or do we necessarily want the police in our schools as first responders to deal with school truants or to deal with a fight on the schoolyard playground? And the answer is a lot of people will say no. It doesn't mean we shouldn't deal with those, but it means there are better institutions and there are better funding mechanisms for tackling homelessness, for example, that maybe we should invest more in social workers. Or maybe,
well, as a former social worker myself, I think that's a great idea. Many people go into social work and they leave because there's no money in it and there's no jobs. And the jobs, the cost of the job emotionally, the toll of the job is so, it's difficult. It's a difficult job to do. And then being underpaid for it means you can't support your own family. A lot of people make the choice to jump ship. So if that was funded, you would be able to have people who have the qualities of, to be able to de-escalate situations, to be able to positively deal with, as you said, kids fighting in the schoolyard, knowing that kids fighting, is normal, is age appropriate, that kind of thing. That would go a long way. So we'll see what happens. Yes, I'm in agreement with you. And I've been saying here on the show that I think, divesting or a word like that, or diverting funds, but that doesn't have sort of the angry punch to defund. And I think, rightfully so, people are angry. And unfortunately that I think that word works against actually getting the policy that folks would want. So
yeah, I think that's true. But, I also think that we're in a moment where remarkably rapid change is happening, and there are huge shifts going on in the public consciousness around really big picture policy issues. And these kind of sort of fast forward moments when, everything's possible, everything's up in the air, they don't happen very often. But when they happen, what you see playing out in public is a debate around language, a debate around policy priorities, a debate about institutions that oftentimes plays out in private. And we're in one of those sort of moments where everything's up in the air. And so we're having these conversations in public. What language do we use around police reform, around criminal justice reform? And yes, some of the language maybe ends up going in a direction that, I wish it didn't go down. But I also think it's, absolutely fascinating to watch these debates playing out in public. I love it. I love the fact that finally, after years and years and years in which the sum total of the debate was, do we give the police in New York City $6 billion or $6.5 billion or $7 billion? Now the debate is, well, maybe we're actually funding them too much. And maybe they don't need military or paramilitary equipment. Maybe they don't need armored personnel carriers. Maybe they don't need all this sort of body armor when they're going into, deal with a domestic dispute or whatever it might be. And suddenly there's room to have a debate, not just about what we can do. Look, we've got a lot of resources and money in this country. We can do an awful lot of things. We can throw billions into paramilitary policing if that's where we want to go. But the debate now is that where we want to go? And increasingly people are saying no, that just because we can give them all the bells and whistles and all of this high-tech sort of near military kind of gear, it doesn't actually make for a better, safer, fairer, more socially just society. And so we're having a conversation about what does make for a better, fairer, safer, more socially just society. I love it. I think it's really, really great that there's finally room in the public sphere for a conversation like this.
And also, as a as a media studies professor myself, and you are a professor of journalism, the old "if it bleeds, it leads" kind of comes into play here with defund the police, making a bigger, shocking, splashing headline that could then lead to actual, conversation around why people are calling to defund the police.
That's right. I mean, look, all political movements understand the sort of shock value of provocative language. That doesn't matter if the movement's on the left or on the right or up in the air or wherever it is. For as long as there has been mass media, politics and the mass media have done this sort of weird tango together where, politicians say things knowing that if they phrase them in a slightly more provocative way, the media is going to pay more attention. And that's not always healthy. And, we see it with Trump that, it can degenerate into something just ghoulish. But this defund the police thing, I think you're right. In part, it's a slogan designed to attract attention. And in the same way as like when you go into a trade union negotiation, you sort of put your more extreme demands up front. Doesn't mean you're going to get them all, but you put them out there hoping that sort of eventually you'll hit a middle ground with the people you're negotiating with. Kind of the same thing, I think, with defund the police, that when all of this settles down in the end, there'll still be law enforcement mechanisms in this country, but we might have reined in the more out of control processes. We might have laws in place saying, look, if you use unjustified force against a non-violent person that you're arresting, you're going to be charged. And if you kill that person, you're going to be charged with murder. There are things that are going to happen in the way we do policing and the way we police policing that are going to completely change our understanding of law enforcement. I think it's a long, long overdue conversation.
Absolutely. Sasha Abramsky, journalist and journalism professor, writing the column for Signal Noise at The Nation. What's coming up in the next column?
Oh, I have one up today, actually. It's on Trump's retweeting of the white nationalist, the white power video out of Florida. And, the Republicans, most of them, Tim Scott being a sort of honorable exception here, but most of the Republicans have either stayed very, very silent on that tweet or kind of bought into the Trumpian line, oh, he didn't hear the white power slogan. He was just sort of trying to thank his supporters in Florida. And my piece is on, the sheer nonsense of that claim. Here's a guy very clearly shouting out white power, white power. It's the only thing that's very clear on the video. And there's Trump retweeting it. Basically Trump's campaign over the last few weeks has degenerated into nothing more or less than the white nationalist campaign. There's nothing to boast about the economy anymore. His coronavirus response is a catastrophe. His foreign policy is a shambles. The only thing he's got is that his base still supports him on white power. And the only other thing he may have is that the more he racks up losses in the Supreme Court, the more he can say to his base, well, we need even more really right-wing judges on the Supreme Court.
I just said that about the abortion decision. Sasha, you and I are on the same page. Yes, very.
That's why you keep having me back on, isn't it?
Because it's hard, because we're like, hey, we won something, but also it's politically easy in the short term to say that's a victory. Of course, we wouldn't want to lose our rights in that area, but in the long term, it's a lever of power that can be pressed to keep an oppressive system.
I mean, look, any of these Supreme Court rulings at the moment, they're marginal victories where progressives win by the skin of their teeth on sort of procedural grounds. If you look at the fact that Roberts is now seen as the moderate middle, that shows how far right the court's gone. And if you read CNN today, Trump's apparently starting to build pressure on Justice Thomas to retire before the election and give them one more younger conservative Supreme Court justice. And Mitch McConnell would confirm that, even though he refused to confirm Garland for nearly a year at the end of the Obama presidency.
Oh, gosh. We're speaking with Sasha Abramsky. Sasha, thanks for joining us on the program today. It's a great discussion that we will keep going when you come back next week. Check out the column Signal Noise, in 2 weeks. Check out the column Signal Noise. And if you want to hear the other interviews we've done with Sasha, check us out on YouTube. They are all there. Thank you for joining us again, Sasha. Appreciate it.